Kingman, Arizona, summer of 1959. The desert sun hung over Route 66 like a brand pressed against pale sky, and the air inside the Canyon Lodge diner smelled of black coffee, bacon grease, and something older, something uglier. A man stood in the parking lot, with his apron still tied around his waist, a cardboard box in his hands, his eyes holding a dignity that the moment around him was doing everything it could to destroy. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And a single figure at a corner table watched from behind the brim of a hat, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. What happened next? Almost nobody ever talked about. Until now. His name was Elroy Simms, and he had been cooking at the Canyon Lodge since 1952. 7 years of 6 in the morning shifts, 7 years of standing over a cast iron grill so hot it cracked the skin on his forearms in August. 7 years of feeding truckers, travellers, families and drifters who came through that stretch of Route 66 the way people pass through dreams, briefly, hungrily, without much thought for what it cost the man who made their meals. Elroy was 53 years old. He had come to Kingman from Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1948, following a brother who said there was more room to breathe out west. And for a while there was. He found work. He found a rhythm. He found a small clapboard house on a dirt road just outside of town where he kept a vegetable garden and a photograph of his late wife Cora on the kitchen windowsill. Cora had died in 1955 from a kidney illness that moved through her faster than either of them had been prepared for. After that, the diner was what Elroy had. The grill, the regulars, the particular kind of purpose that comes from feeding people well. He was not a loud man. He was not a man who asked for much. He came to work early, stayed late when they needed him, and never once called in sick, even during the 2 winters, when the pipes froze and he had to walk the 2 miles from his house in the dark, because the truck wouldn't start in the cold. The other staff knew him as a man who hummed old gospel songs under his breath, while he cooked not loudly, just enough for the melody to drift, quiet as smoke, through the kitchen. What happened that July morning in 1959 began as small injustices often do, with an accusation that could not be disproved because no one in the room was willing to try. A till had come up short, $3.40. The owner of the Canyon Lodge, a man named Gerald Purvis, had been looking for a reason for months. The territory Elroy occupied, skilled, steady, respected by the regulars, had grown uncomfortable for Gerald in ways Gerald would never have been honest enough to name. So when the drawer came up short that Thursday morning, Gerald did not check the receipts. He did not review the morning's orders. He walked into the kitchen, pointed at Elroy, and said the words that stripped a man of 7 years in 30 seconds. Elroy stood without flinching. He untied his apron slowly, deliberately, as though the act itself were a kind of prayer, folded it across the counter, and walked to the back room for his things. When he came out through the front door of the Canyon Lodge diner, cardboard box in hand, the late morning sun hit him full in the face. A dozen people sat at tables and booths inside. Not one of them moved. Not one of them said a word. And outside, in that blazing July silence, Elroy Simms stood in the gravel with nowhere particular to go, and the weight of what had just happened settled over him like something he had always half expected and never stopped hoping wouldn't come. He had come into the Canyon Lodge that morning the way he came into most places along that stretch of Route 66, quietly, without ceremony, looking for nothing more than a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, before the day's work took him further down the road. He was a large man in a plain cotton shirt and dark trousers, his hat pulled low against the glare. He sat at a corner table, the one with the view of both the kitchen pass-through and the front door. Old habits from years on film sets, perhaps, or maybe just the preference of a man who liked to see what was coming. He had been filming in the region that summer, out near the red rock formations east of Kingman, where the light did things to the landscape that no studio could manufacture. He knew this part of Arizona well. He had driven these roads before, knew the way the heat sat differently here than in California, thicker and more honest somehow, without the ocean's apology behind it. He liked the Southwest. He liked the silence of it, when he could find it, which was less and less as his face became the kind of face that entire rooms reorganized themselves around. This morning, though, people were focused elsewhere. The argument from the back had moved to the front of the house quickly, the way these things did when someone wanted an audience. He heard Gerald Purvis's voice, first tight, clipped, the particular register of a man who has already decided and is now simply performing the deciding. He watched through the pass-through window as Elroy stood in the kitchen, still composed, his hands at his sides. He watched Elroy untie that apron, and something shifted in the man at the corner table, something behind the eyes. A settling, the kind that happens when a person moves from observation into decision. He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down with care, pushed back his chair. By the time Elroy came through the front door with his cardboard box, the man at the corner table was already reaching for his wallet. He laid 2 bills on the table, far more than the coffee cost, and stood to his full height. The booth beside him emptied slightly of air, the way space tends to do when certain presences fill it. He settled his hat and walked to the front door, and if any of the other diners looked up long enough to see his face clearly, they would have recognized it instantly. But they were looking at Elroy, or rather, they were looking away from Elroy, which is a different thing entirely, and somehow worse. Side in the gravel lot, the man stepped into the sunlight and let his eyes adjust. Elroy was standing near the road, the box under one arm, looking at nothing in particular with the focused gaze of a man deciding how to carry himself through the next hour. He didn't look up right away. People didn't generally approach him out here in parking lots. Not with kindness anyway. Hold on a minute. The voice was unmistakable. Deep, unhurried, shaped by 2 decades of cinema and a genuine Western cadence that no acting coach had manufactured. Elroy turned, and for a moment his expression did the thing that happens when a face recognizes something it wasn't prepared to recognize: a brief, involuntary stillness, like a man who has just stepped into an unexpected patch of shade. John Wayne stood in the gravel of the Canyon Lodge parking lot in Kingman, Arizona, in July of 1959, and he was not in costume. He was not performing. He was simply standing there, with the weight of what he had just witnessed written plainly across his face. He asked Elroy what had happened. Elroy told him briefly, without embellishment, the way men who are used to not being believed tend to tell things: the short amount missing, the accusation, the 7 years that counted for nothing when Gerald Purvis decided they shouldn't. Wayne listened without interrupting. He nodded once when Elroy finished, and his jaw worked the way it did on screen sometimes, that quiet processing, that slow burn. Then he turned around and walked back into the diner. What happened inside took less than 10 minutes, but those who were present would describe it differently depending on who asked them and when. What is agreed upon is this: Wayne walked to the counter, asked to speak to Gerald Purvis, and when Gerald came out from the back, initially delighted. The way men like Gerald become when celebrities appear in their establishments, Wayne did not shake his hand. He asked, in a measured but entirely serious tone, whether Gerald had any proof that Elroy had taken anything. Gerald said that was his business. Wayne said it had become his. He pulled out his wallet, placed enough money on the counter to cover what had allegedly gone missing several times over, and told Gerald Purvis in front of the staff, the cook who had replaced Elroy at the grill, and every diner who suddenly found reason to look up from their plates, that a man who fires a good employee on an accusation with no evidence is not a man running a business. He is a man running something else. He left the money on the counter and walked back out the door. Elroy hadn't moved. He was still standing near the road when Wayne came back out, and he watched the tall man cross the gravel toward him with that familiar, unhurried stride. What happened next was witnessed by 2 people who were loading a truck at the gas station across the road, by the Canyon Lodge's youngest waitress, a 19-year-old named Patricia Howe, who had followed to watch through the front window, and by a travelling salesman from Flagstaff, who happened to be walking back to his car and stopped walking when he realised what he was seeing. Wayne didn't offer Elroy the money directly. He was too instinctively decent for that. too aware of what the gesture could cost a man's pride if handled wrong. Instead, he asked Elroy if he knew of anyone hiring in town. Elroy said there was a roadhouse 11 miles east that had been looking for a cook since March. Wayne said that was good to know. Then he reached into his breast pocket and produced a small card, the kind people in his position used to carry when they needed to communicate weight without making a scene, and he held it out. "You ever need a reference," he said, "use this." Elroy took the card. He held it in both hands for a moment and looked at it. Then he looked up at the man who had just walked back into a diner in Arizona in 1959 and spent his own considerable reputation like currency on behalf of a cook he had never met. His expression said everything and nothing at once. Patricia Howe, watching through the window, said later that she cried. Not from sadness, she said, from something she didn't have a word for at 19, that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately. The salesman from Flagstaff got into his car and sat there for several minutes before he could bring himself to drive. And the two men at the gas station looked at each other and said nothing, because sometimes silence is the only honest response to a moment that language arrives at too slowly. Wayne tipped his hat and walked to his vehicle. He drove east toward the Red Rock and the film set and the particular kind of day that waits for no one, not even men who have just done something quietly extraordinary. Elroy Simms did get the job at the Roadhouse 11 miles east. He was hired within a week at better pay than Gerald Purvis had ever offered, and he worked there for 11 more years before his knees finally gave him an ultimatum he couldn't argue with. He kept the card in his wallet until the wallet fell apart, and then he kept the card in the kitchen drawer beside the photograph of Cora on the windowsill. He never spoke publicly about what happened in the Canyon Lodge parking lot. He wasn't a man who sought audiences, and the story belonged to him in a way he wasn't willing to dilute. But his niece, Dorothea, who visited him each Christmas in Kingman, heard it from him in pieces over many years, the way old men sometimes release the weight of a moment gradually, the way you might let out a breath you've been holding since 1959. What Wayne did that day cost him something, even if no one wrote about it. Arizona in 1959 was not a place that universally rewarded white men who stood up in parking lots on behalf of black men accused of things they hadn't done. There were other business owners along Route 66. There were other people in that diner who had seen his face and would carry home an opinion about what he had chosen to do with it. Reputation was not an infinite resource, even for a man with his name. And yet, he had not hesitated. This is the part that Dorothea said her uncle returned to most often in the telling. Not what Wayne said. Not the card, not the money on the counter, not the confrontation with Gerald Purvis. The thing that stayed with Elroy Simms was the speed of it. The fact that the decision for John Wayne appeared to require almost no time at all. There was one moment right before Wayne walked back to his truck when he stopped and turned back to Elroy. Just once. The desert light was doing what Arizona desert light does in July, making everything simpler and more severe at once. And the two men looked at each other across a few feet of gravel in a country that had spent most of its history ensuring they would never look at each other as equals. Wayne said nothing in that moment. Dorothea said her uncle described it as a look that contained an apology, not for anything Wayne had done, but for everything else. For the room full of people who had said nothing. For the system that had put a cardboard box in a decent man's hands and called it justice. For the particular American silence that descends over injustice like a second sky. You deserved better than this morning, Wayne said quietly. That was all. Elroy nodded, and John Wayne drove east. There's a version of history that gets written down in books, and a version that lives in kitchen drawers and Christmas conversations and the memories of 19-year-old waitresses who grew into old women still, searching for the right word to describe what they saw through a diner window. In Arizona, in the summer of 1959, John Wayne was many things complicated, contradicted, mythologized in ways that history is still untangling. But on that July morning on Route 66, he was simply a man who saw something wrong and decided, in the space of one cup of coffee, that being a bystander was not something he was willing to be. That choice cost him almost nothing in the grand scale of his life. But to Elroy Simms, it may have been the difference between a morning that broke something and a morning that held. That is the quiet math of decency, the way a small act, properly placed, carries weight the person who performed it rarely fully understands. We talk a great deal about heroes in the grand cinematic sense, the ones who charge and shout and are witnessed by crowds. But there is another kind of heroism that happens in parking lots in small towns when no cameras are rolling, and it asks only one thing of the person who practices it: the willingness to move when everyone else has decided to stay still. What would you have done in that diner? And who in your own life has offered you a look across a parking lot, silent, steady, and full of everything that needed to be said at exactly the moment you needed it most? Tell us in the comments, because the stories that never make the front page are so often the ones that matter most.